She called the cowboy a nuisance, but he couldn't stop watching her. The sun hung low over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The small town of Cedar Creek buzzed with life as it did every Saturday morning, but it was a different kind of quiet, the kind where the air carries the scent of fresh hay, leather saddles, and baked bread from the little bakery at the corner. Among the stalls lining the town square, Clara Jenkins carefully adjusted her painting stand. She was 28, with sun-streaked hair tied into a loose ponytail and a streak of paint across her cheek that she hadn't bothered to wipe away. Today, she was determined to capture the morning light on canvas before it faded, despite the stubborn wind that liked to tug at her easel and threaten her sketches. Clara had always loved this part of life, the way ordinary things could become extraordinary if she looked at them long enough. The old wooden fences, the wildflowers growing between the cracks in the sidewalk, the distant hum of horses grazing behind the barn fences, these were her muses. She liked the quiet, the way the world seemed to slow down just for a moment, giving her a chance to notice the tiny details others walked past. As she adjusted her canvas, a sudden gust of wind blew across the square, catching the corner of her painting and almost knocking it to the ground. Clara reached out quickly, her hands brushing against the rough wood of the easel. Just as she steadied it, she felt another pair of hands lightly grasp the canvas. "I've got it," a deep, calm voice said. Clara looked up to see a man standing there. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a dusty brown hat shadowing sharp, observing eyes. His boots were scuffed, and the smell of leather and the outdoors seemed to cling to him. There was an ease to the way he held himself, a quiet strength in his posture. "Thanks," Clara said quickly, stepping back and brushing her hands on her jeans. "But I had it." He gave a small smile, not the kind that tried to charm, but the kind that suggested he wasn't bothered by her words. "I just thought I'd help. Wind can be tricky with those big canvases." Clara turned her attention back to her painting, adjusting the brush in her hand with deliberate care. "I said I've got it," she repeated, her tone sharper this time. She didn't like people hovering, not when she was focused. This stranger had no business interfering with her work, and yet, for some reason, she found it impossible to ignore the way he seemed calm, almost unshakable. The man tipped his hat slightly, a gesture that was polite but also distant, as if he knew his presence might be unwelcome. "Well, just in case," he said softly, stepping back. "I'll leave it to you." Clara watched him walk away, a strange mix of irritation and curiosity bubbling in her chest. Who was this man? He looked like he had stepped straight out of the past, someone who belonged more in the wide fields than in the middle of a bustling town square. She frowned at her canvas, realizing she had lost a bit of the perfect light she had wanted to capture. But even as she painted, her brush strokes slightly more rushed than usual, her eyes kept drifting toward him. He was moving with purpose, but not hurriedly, crossing the square toward the feed store with a calmness that seemed almost unnatural in the busy Saturday morning crowd. Clara shook her head, telling herself she shouldn't be watching him at all. She had work to do, and strangers were usually just strangers. Yet as the morning went on, she noticed him again. He was buying supplies, some rope, feed, and a few tools that looked well used but cared for. He didn't seem interested in anything else around him, moving with a steady rhythm that contrasted with the hurried energy of the town. Every so often, he glanced around, and Clara could swear one of those glances was directed her way. She frowned, brushing it off as her imagination. By late morning, the square had grown busier. Families strolled past, children laughing as they chased each other around the stalls, and the smell of freshly baked bread mingled with the earthy scent of the livestock pens at the edge of the square. Clara tried to lose herself in her work, her brush moving across the canvas with more focus. She was painting the old wooden fence near the riverbank, capturing the light as it danced across the weathered wood. Each stroke required patience, observation, and care. But every now and then, she felt a presence behind her, subtle but unmistakable. She could hear the faint shuffle of boots on the cobblestones, the rustle of clothing as someone moved carefully around the market. She forced herself to ignore it, telling herself she was imagining things. People always looked at art, after all. Then she felt it again, a gaze that lingered a little too long. She looked up quickly, her eyes scanning the square, and saw him. The man from earlier, the cowboy with the dusty brown hat standing near the fountain. He wasn't staring in a rude or intrusive way. No, it was different. He seemed curious, interested, and for a moment Clara felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel, unsettled. Her instincts were telling her to turn away, to focus on her canvas, to not give in to whatever strange pull she felt toward him. Yet part of her couldn't look away. There was something in the way he carried himself, something quiet and strong that made her heart beat a little faster without even realizing it. She hated that she noticed him so much. Minutes passed, and Clara tried to push the feeling down, focusing on the shadows along the fence posts, the tiny cracks in the wood, the way the sunlight hit each nail differently. But no matter how hard she concentrated, she could feel him there in the corner of her awareness. And then, as if the universe was determined to irritate her, the wind picked up again, stronger this time, threatening to topple her easel completely. Before she could react, a hand reached out and steadied the canvas. She whipped around, ready to snap at whoever it was. But it was him, the cowboy. "I told you," he said gently, "wind can be tricky." Clara's cheeks flushed and she stepped back sharply. I said I had it," she exclaimed, frustration mixing with embarrassment. She didn't know why he kept showing up, why he seemed to know exactly when to appear, or why she couldn't help but feel, watched. He tilted his head slightly, studying her, and then simply said, "I won't bother you again." Something in his tone made her pause. There was no malice there, no intention to annoy her. Just calm, simple words. She huffed softly and turned back to her painting, her brush trembling slightly as her hands worked to steady themselves. The morning passed in a blur of colors, brush strokes, and occasional glances toward the square. Clara kept her focus on her work, but she couldn't deny the sense that the world had shifted just a little. She wasn't used to noticing anyone, let alone a stranger who seemed to appear at the exact right or wrong moments. By noon, the town square was crowded. Vendors called out their prices, children darted between stalls, and the smell of sizzling meat from the barbecue stand made her stomach rumble. Clara took a deep breath and tried to ignore it all. She was used to this life, the rhythm of the small town, the predictable patterns of the market. But today felt different. And then she saw him again, moving past the crowd toward the edge of the square, near the riverbank where the wildflowers grew. He glanced back once and their eyes met. Clara felt a strange flutter in her chest, an unfamiliar sensation that made her tighten her grip on her brush. She quickly looked away, focusing on the fence and the sunlight, pretending she hadn't noticed him at all. He lingered there for a few moments, as if he wanted to stay but respected her space, before slowly walking away, disappearing behind the line of trees that marked the start of the open fields. Clara exhaled slowly, a mix of relief and disappointment washing over her. She didn't understand why she cared, why his presence affected her so deeply. She was used to solitude, to relying only on herself. She wasn't used to this. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. She sold a few small paintings, offered a few smiles to the neighbors who passed by, and packed up her supplies as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. The light turned softer, warmer, painting the town in shades of orange and pink. Clara hoisted her canvas onto her shoulder and started walking toward her little studio at the edge of town. As she walked, she couldn't help but glance toward the open fields one last time. And there, just standing on the hill where the wildflowers swayed in the breeze, was the cowboy. He wasn't watching her now, not really, but she could feel his presence as if he had left a mark on the air itself. Clara shook her head, a small, ironic smile tugging at her lips. She hated that she noticed him so much. She hated that he had somehow become part of her day, part of the rhythm she had always controlled so carefully. And yet, as she turned the corner toward her studio, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Who was this man? Why did he seem to know when to appear, when to help, when to disappear? And most importantly, why couldn't she stop thinking about him? For the first time in a long while, Clara felt the stirrings of curiosity, not about her art, not about the town, but about someone else. Someone who didn't belong in her world, yet somehow had found a way into it. And she knew, deep down, that tomorrow might be just as complicated, just as strange, and just as impossible to ignore. The next Saturday arrived with the same golden sunlight that seemed to bless Cedar Creek every weekend. Clara Jenkins adjusted her painting stand again, her fingers brushing against the worn wood as if seeking comfort in its familiarity. She had been thinking about yesterday's encounter all week, the man, the cowboy with the dusty brown hat who had appeared at just the right moments. She tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept returning like an echo she could not ignore. Clara had a routine she liked to follow. She arrived early to secure a good spot near the fountain in the town square, where the light fell just right on the old wooden fences and the wildflowers along the edges. She unpacked her paints and brushes, humming softly as she laid out her canvases. Despite the calm she tried to cultivate, a part of her was restless. She kept glancing toward the path that led to the feed store, almost expecting to see him again. And of course she did. Luke Carson appeared just as the market began to fill with people. He carried a small bag of supplies, his boots kicking up tiny puffs of dust as he walked with a casual purpose. He didn't look around much. His eyes, calm and steady, seemed fixed on some invisible point in the distance. Yet, when his gaze met hers for the briefest moment, Clara felt a flicker of irritation mixed with something she could not name. "I hope he doesn't come over," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. She set to work, her brush moving in long, deliberate strokes across a canvas that was starting to show the early shapes of a painting she had envisioned for weeks. But luck, or perhaps fate, had other plans. A loud crash came from the other side of the square, and Clara turned just in time to see a small boy trip over the edge of the fountain, splashing water onto his mother's skirt. The crowd gasped, and in an instant Luke was there, steadying the boy and offering a hand to help him back onto the cobblestones. Clara found herself watching, unable to look away, as he handled the situation with quiet care, a small, reassuring smile on his face. Her irritation softened just a little. He wasn't boastful, wasn't showing off, but there was something about the way he moved through the world that suggested he noticed the small things, the things that mattered. Clara's hand trembled slightly as she returned to her painting, the colors blending into shapes that were sharper, more precise, more alive than before. Throughout the morning, their paths crossed repeatedly. At the feed store, Clara saw him helping the owner carry a bale of hay. At the diner, he held the door open for an elderly woman, giving her a small nod that was polite but entirely unobtrusive. Each time she saw him, she felt a strange mix of irritation and fascination. He seemed different from anyone she had ever met. And no matter how much she told herself to ignore him, she found herself noticing the details, the way his hands moved with skill, the quiet way he surveyed his surroundings, the ease with which he offered help without expecting thanks. By late morning, Clara was growing frustrated with her own thoughts. She was supposed to be painting, not thinking about a man she barely knew. She tried to concentrate, focusing on the way the sunlight caught the edges of the fence posts and the delicate shadows that danced across the wildflowers. Yet every so often, she caught a glimpse of him through the crowd, always moving with calm purpose, always just out of reach. It was near the riverbank where their next encounter truly began. Clara had been walking along the path, carrying a small canvas she intended to finish later, when she spotted a runaway horse bolting across the field. Its mane whipped wildly in the wind, its hooves pounding the ground in a frantic rhythm. Without thinking, Clara ran toward it, her voice calling out in a mixture of fear and urgency. But before she could reach the horse, Luke appeared as if from nowhere. He moved with astonishing speed and skill, dropping to his knees and extending a rope with practiced precision. Within moments, he had the horse under control, calming it with soft, measured words. Clara watched, breathless, as he guided the animal back toward the barn, his movements fluid, almost effortless. "You're amazing," she said finally, once the horse was secured. She didn't know why the words slipped out. Normally, she would have kept her admiration hidden, tucked safely away where it couldn't make her feel vulnerable. Luke looked at her, tilting his head slightly, his calm eyes meeting hers. "It's nothing. I've dealt with runaway horses plenty of times. You did the right thing by calling for help." Clara hesitated, caught between gratitude and pride. "I didn't need help," she said, almost defensively. "I just didn't want the horse to get hurt." "I know," Luke replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I could see that, but sometimes help is exactly what we need, even if we don't want to admit it." Clara blinked, unsure how to respond. His words were simple, almost ordinary, yet there was a weight to them that made her pause. For a moment, she considered walking away, but something held her in place. Something about the quiet strength in his voice, the way he seemed genuinely concerned, made it difficult to turn her back. They stood there for a while, the sound of the river flowing nearby, the wind rustling the leaves in the trees. Clara found herself noticing details she had never paid attention to before. The way the sunlight highlighted the strands of his hair, the subtle creases around his eyes that suggested a life spent outdoors, the gentle firmness of his hands. She realized with a mix of embarrassment and fascination that she was studying him as much as he had studied the horse. "I should get back to my painting," she said finally, her voice a mixture of resolve and reluctance. She started to step away, but he didn't move. "You will," he said softly, "but not until the horse is safe." Clara nodded, feeling an unfamiliar warmth in her chest. For the first time, she allowed herself to see him not as a nuisance, not as an intrusive stranger, but as someone who had quietly earned her attention. Over the next hour, they walked along the riverbank together. Clara pointed out the areas she intended to paint, and Luke listened, asking gentle questions about her technique and the colors she preferred. He didn't offer advice unless she asked, and when he did, it was careful and respectful, never overbearing. Clara found herself enjoying the conversation more than she expected. He wasn't trying to impress her, and yet every word he spoke made her feel understood in a way few people had ever managed. As the sun climbed higher, casting a warm glow over the landscape, Clara realized that she had been smiling more than she had in days. She laughed at small jokes he made, felt a rush of pride when he complimented her work, and even found herself glancing at him when he wasn't looking. Each glance brought a mix of irritation and curiosity. She hated that she noticed him so much, yet she couldn't stop. Eventually, they returned to the town square. The crowd had grown, and the market was in full swing. Clara set up her easel again, trying to focus on her painting, but Luke lingered nearby, watching respectfully from a distance. He didn't hover, didn't comment, just stood quietly, as if he had decided that simply being present was enough. Clara kept her focus on her canvas, but she could feel his gaze like a gentle pressure at the back of her mind. It was both comforting and frustrating. She didn't want to admit that she enjoyed the attention, that his presence made the world feel a little brighter, a little more alive. And yet, she couldn't deny it. As the morning turned to afternoon, Clara noticed that Luke had disappeared from sight. She felt a small pang of disappointment, realizing that she had grown accustomed to seeing him nearby. It was strange, she thought, how someone could enter your life in such a subtle way and yet leave such a strong impression. Clara continued to paint, her strokes more confident, her colors more vibrant. She realized that she was inspired not just by the landscape, but by the unexpected connection she had experienced. It was thrilling in a quiet, almost terrifying way to acknowledge that her world had shifted even slightly because of someone she barely knew. By the time she packed up her supplies and headed toward her studio, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Luke Carson, the cowboy who had seemed to appear wherever he was needed, the man who had quietly captured her attention without trying, was now a presence she could not ignore. And for the first time in a long while, Clara felt the stirrings of curiosity, wonder, and perhaps even something deeper, a feeling she was not yet ready to name. As she walked home, the wind carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh hay, Clara knew one thing for certain. Life in Cedar Creek had suddenly become more unpredictable, more vivid, and infinitely more interesting. And she wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or grateful. The week had been unusually warm for early spring, but by Friday evening, the sky had begun to darken in heavy shades of gray. Clara Jenkins was in her little studio at the edge of town, putting the final touches on a painting she had been working on for days. The wind rattled the windows and the faint smell of rain drifted through the open door. She frowned, sensing the approaching storm, but continued her work. Storms were common in Cedar Creek, and she had learned to trust her instincts. Still, something about this one felt different. By early evening, the first drops of rain began to fall. Clara closed her studio door and peered out, watching as the small town streets quickly darkened under the thick clouds. The wind picked up, tugging at the shutters and whipping her hair across her face. She adjusted the easel near the window, hoping to protect her latest canvas. But as the storm grew stronger, a loud crash echoed through the studio. A gust of wind had blown open the back door, and she rushed to close it before any more damage could be done. Her heart raced as another gust tore through the air, sending papers and smaller canvases skittering across the floor. Clara tried to secure everything, but the storm was relentless. She struggled with the larger canvases, their wet edges heavy and awkward in her hands. Panic began to rise in her chest. Weeks of work, her best pieces, were at risk of being ruined. Just as she reached for a particularly large canvas near the window, a familiar voice called out from the doorway. "Clara!" She spun around and saw Luke Carson standing there, his hat slightly askew, rain soaking his shoulders, but his eyes steady and calm. Her initial reaction was shock. "Luke, what are you doing here?" she exclaimed, worry and surprise mixing in her voice. "I saw the storm coming," he said simply, stepping inside. "Figured you might need some help." Clara blinked, a mixture of frustration and relief flooding her. She wanted to argue, to tell him she didn't need help, but the truth was clear. She did. The storm was too strong for her to manage alone. Luke moved quickly, steadying the canvases Clara struggled with and lifting them out of the worst of the rain. His hands were sure and confident, his movements smooth and practiced. Clara watched, a strange mix of gratitude and awe swelling in her chest. She had always valued her independence, but now she realized that sometimes needing help didn't make her weak. Together, they moved the paintings to a safer corner of the studio, stacking them carefully and draping cloths over the most delicate pieces. Clara noticed how calm Luke remained despite the chaos, how he seemed unaffected by the pounding rain and gusting wind. It was as if he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice quiet. She had never admitted it before, but her hands were trembling from the effort, and her heart still raced from the adrenaline of fear. Luke glanced at her, his expression gentle. "It's nothing. I couldn't just leave you to handle this alone." For a moment they stood in silence, the sound of rain hammering the roof filling the space between them. Clara felt a strange warmth in her chest, a realization that she hadn't expected. She had spent so long relying only on herself, building walls around her life, her work, and her heart. And yet in this moment she realized that having someone by her side, someone steady, dependable, and kind, didn't feel like weakness. It felt like safety. The storm raged on through the night. Clara and Luke worked together, moving supplies, covering canvases, and even salvaging a few pieces that had started to get wet. Luke's quiet presence was reassuring, and Clara found herself talking to him in ways she rarely spoke to anyone. She told him about the inspiration behind her paintings, the places that mattered to her, and the memories that shaped her art. Luke listened, never interrupting, never judging. He asked questions at the right moments, offering gentle observations that made her think, rather than dictating or correcting her. Clara was surprised at how easy it was to share her thoughts with him, how natural it felt to let someone into her world. At one point, a particularly large gust of wind burst through the window she had failed to close properly, sending a canvas crashing to the floor. Clara gasped, rushing to pick it up, and Luke was immediately there, steadying the painting with his hands. Their fingers brushed, and for a brief moment, Clara felt a jolt of awareness, a spark she couldn't ignore. She looked at him, and for the first time she saw not just a cowboy, not just a helper, but a man who genuinely cared about her work, her safety, and even her feelings. "You're amazing," she said softly, almost in disbelief. She hadn't meant to speak, but the words slipped out before she could stop them. Luke's eyes softened. "You've got talent, Clara. I just want to make sure it's safe." It wasn't just the storm outside that was intense. It was the storm inside her. She realized that she had been living with walls so high that no one could reach her, and now, slowly, she was letting someone in. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Hours passed as they worked together. The rain finally began to ease, turning into a gentle drizzle that tapped softly against the windows. Clara stepped back to look at the studio, the canvases now safe. The chaos of the storm turned into quiet order. She felt a sense of calm she hadn't known she needed, a quiet gratitude for the man who had appeared when she least expected it. Luke stood beside her, watching her survey her work. "You did a great job," he said simply. "Even with the storm, your art is still beautiful." Clara smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you," she admitted. The words were heavy with meaning, and she felt a weight lift from her chest as she spoke them. Luke tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. "I didn't do much," he said quietly, but Clara knew better. He had been her anchor through the chaos, steadying her, helping her, and showing her that she didn't always have to face life alone. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to see him not as a nuisance, not as an intruder, but as someone who had quietly become important to her. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a realization that the world could be kinder than she had believed. As the storm passed and the sky cleared, the two of them stepped outside. The air smelled fresh, filled with the earthy scent of rain-soaked grass and wildflowers. The town had quieted down, the streets empty except for the occasional passerby. Clara felt a strange sense of peace, a feeling that perhaps life was not meant to be endured alone. Luke looked at her, his expression gentle and steady. "I'll stay nearby," he said softly, "just in case." Clara laughed lightly, a sound of relief and amusement. "You really are persistent, aren't you?" she teased. "I guess," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "But only when it matters." For a moment they stood in silence, the calm after the storm surrounding them. Clara realized that her world had shifted in ways she hadn't anticipated. The man she had once thought of as a nuisance had become her ally, her protector, and perhaps something more. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time she felt the possibility of connection, trust, and even friendship. As the sun set over Cedar Creek, casting a warm glow over the wet streets and glistening rooftops, Clara and Luke walked back toward the town together. They didn't speak much, but the silence was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. She felt a sense of gratitude she hadn't known she could feel for someone she barely knew, and yet, somehow, she knew he had earned it. By the time they reached her studio, Clara realized that the storm had changed more than just her paintings. It had changed her perspective, her understanding of trust, and her willingness to let someone into her life. Luke had shown her that help wasn't weakness, that kindness could be quiet yet profound, and that sometimes the right person appeared exactly when they were needed most. As she watched him leave, tipping his hat in farewell, Clara felt a flutter in her chest. She no longer saw him as a nuisance. She saw him as someone she could rely on, someone who had earned her attention and perhaps, in time, her trust. And for the first time in a long while, Clara felt a spark of hope. A hope that life could be shared, even in the smallest ways, with someone who truly understood and cared. The storm had passed, but its mark remained, not on the town, not on the streets, but on Clara's heart. And she knew that tomorrow, when the sun rose over Cedar Creek once again, her world and her feelings would be just a little different than before. The morning after the storm dawned with a gentle light, soft and warm, as if the world itself had exhaled and settled into calm. Cedar Creek was quiet, the streets still damp from the night's rain, and the air carried the fresh, earthy smell of wet grass and flowers. Clara Jenkins stepped outside her studio, stretching her arms and taking a deep breath. The storm had left its mark, not only on the town, with puddles along the cobblestone streets and leaves scattered across the sidewalks, but also on her. She felt lighter somehow, as though the weight she had carried for years had been lifted, leaving her ready to see the world in a new way. Clara had spent the previous evening thinking about Luke Carson. She tried to tell herself it was just gratitude for his help during the storm, but she knew it was more than that. She had begun to realize how much she appreciated his presence, not just for the practical help he had given her, but for the calm and steadying way he made her feel. She found herself wondering what he was doing now, if he was thinking of her as she thought of him. It wasn't long before she saw him. Luke was near the riverbank, as he often seemed to be, tending to the horses grazing along the edge of the field. Even from a distance, he looked grounded, a part of the land itself. His movements were precise and calm, yet there was an energy to him that drew her gaze. Clara felt a flutter of anticipation, a nervous excitement she hadn't felt in a long time. She picked up her brushes and decided to paint, telling herself she needed to focus on her work. But part of her knew she was really painting with him in mind. As she set up her easel near the square, Luke walked toward the town slowly, his steps unhurried but deliberate. When he reached her, he stopped, tipping his hat in a small, respectful gesture. "Good morning, Clara," he said, his voice carrying the same calm warmth that had so often steadied her heart. "Good morning," she replied, smiling despite herself. There was a rhythm to seeing him, a comfort she had not anticipated. She had expected awkwardness, perhaps a few tense words, but instead there was an easy understanding that had begun to grow between them. The day passed slowly, filled with the quiet rhythm of life in Cedar Creek. Clara painted, her brush moving with a new confidence, capturing the way the sunlight reflected off the wet streets and the way the leaves shimmered after the storm. Luke stayed nearby, offering quiet companionship rather than intrusive conversation. He didn't hover, he didn't impose. He simply existed in her world, and in doing so made it richer. Later, as the sun climbed higher, they found themselves walking together toward the outskirts of town, where the fields opened into wide, rolling hills. Clara carried a canvas under her arm, while Luke led a horse gently by the reins. Neither spoke much at first, but the silence was comfortable, filled with the sound of wind rustling through grass and distant bird calls. "I've been thinking," Clara said finally, her voice soft, almost hesitant, "about what you said during the storm. About needing help sometimes." Luke glanced at her, his expression patient. "Yes, I realized you were right. I've always tried to do everything alone," she admitted. "I didn't think I needed anyone, but yesterday you showed me that it's not weak to accept help. It's necessary sometimes." Luke smiled, a small, genuine expression that made her chest feel warm. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just wanted to make sure your work was safe, and that you were safe too." Clara looked down at her feet, then back at him. "You really care, don't you?" she asked quietly, the words almost a whisper. "I do," he said simply, his eyes steady. "I've been watching you, yes, but not in a way that intrudes. I wanted to see you thrive, to see your art succeed, and to make sure you didn't face challenges alone." The honesty in his words struck Clara. She felt a rush of gratitude and something deeper, an emotional connection she could no longer ignore. She realized that Luke's presence was not just comforting, it was inspiring. It reminded her that life could be shared, that the strength of independence didn't mean she had to be alone. Over the next few weeks, their friendship deepened naturally. Luke would help Clara gather supplies for her paintings, offer advice when she asked, or simply walk with her through the fields as she sketched the landscape. He never pushed, never demanded her attention, but his presence became an essential part of her routine. Clara found herself looking forward to these moments, eager to share her thoughts and discoveries with him. One afternoon, a gallery owner visited Cedar Creek, drawn by the whispers of Clara's talent. The woman toured Clara's studio and viewed her work with keen interest, asking questions and complimenting her technique. Clara felt a mix of pride and nerves. This was an opportunity she had dreamed of, but exposure also brought vulnerability. Luke stayed nearby, quiet and observant. He didn't interfere, but when Clara faltered, unsure of what to say, he gave her a reassuring nod. His silent support steadied her nerves, and she found herself speaking with confidence, explaining her inspiration and techniques. By the time the gallery owner left, Clara had received an invitation to display her paintings in a small exhibit in the city. She felt a thrill of excitement, knowing her art would reach beyond Cedar Creek. Later, as she cleaned up her studio, Clara turned to Luke. "I couldn't have done that without you," she said, her voice warm and sincere. "You did all the work," he replied, shrugging lightly, though there was a hint of pride in his eyes. "I just made sure you had the space to do it." Clara smiled, realizing that he had done more than he let on. He had been her anchor, her quiet encourager, and her steady companion when she needed it most. She could no longer deny the depth of her feelings. Gratitude had grown into something richer, something that made her heart beat faster when he was near. As spring turned into early summer, their bond became a visible part of the town. Neighbors noticed the independent artist and the quiet cowboy walking together, sharing stories, laughing, and tending to the fields and animals. Clara had once been fiercely solitary, but now she felt a sense of connection she hadn't known she was missing. Luke had shown her that companionship did not diminish independence. It enhanced it, adding depth, warmth, and joy to her life. One evening, as the sun set over the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, Clara and Luke stood at the edge of the riverbank, watching the reflection of light ripple across the water. The air was still, the kind of peaceful quiet that invited reflection. "Do you ever think about the future?" Clara asked, her voice thoughtful. "All the time," Luke replied, "but I don't plan too rigidly. Life has a way of surprising you." Clara nodded, understanding what he meant. She had spent years trying to control everything in her life, her work, her solitude, her emotions. But she had learned that some of the most meaningful moments came unexpectedly, like the storm, like him. "Then maybe the future can include more than just work," she said softly, a hint of a smile on her lips. Luke looked at her, his gaze steady and warm. "I think that sounds like a good plan." They walked back toward the town together, the sky now deepening into twilight. Clara felt a sense of fulfillment she had never known. She had begun the journey fiercely independent, wary of distraction and intrusion, and now she found herself embracing connection, companionship, and even love in ways she hadn't imagined. Luke was no longer just the man who had appeared during the storm. He had become a part of her world, someone whose presence made life brighter, richer, and more meaningful. By the time they reached her studio, Clara turned to him and laughed softly. "I never thought I'd say this," she admitted, "but I don't think I'd want to face life without you around anymore." Luke smiled, tipping his hat with a gentle flourish. "Good, because I don't plan on going anywhere." Clara felt a warmth in her chest, a mixture of joy, relief, and anticipation. The town of Cedar Creek continued its quiet rhythm, but her world had shifted. She had learned the value of trust, the importance of support, and the beauty of a bond that grew quietly, patiently, and sincerely. And as she watched Luke disappear down the path toward his ranch, she knew that the connection they had forged would endure. For Clara, the storm had been more than a test of her skill or her resilience. It had been a turning point, a moment that revealed the power of trust, friendship, and love. And in Luke, she had found someone who would walk beside her, steady and steadfast, ready to face whatever the future might bring. That evening, as the stars began to appear in the clear night sky, Clara sat by her window, sketching the hills in gentle strokes, thinking of the day, of the storm, and of the man who had become such an important part of her life. She smiled to herself, realizing that life had a way of surprising you in ways more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. Luke Carson was no longer a stranger, no longer a nuisance, and certainly no longer someone she could ignore. He was her friend, her companion, and in time, perhaps something even deeper. And Clara knew in her heart that together they could face any storm, literal or metaphorical, that life might bring.